we found that even people with aphantasia who have no visual mental imagery still get DMT entities. And so it's not being visually driven.
Fascinating. One of the characteristics that's frequently brought up is the consistency of these trip reports. And like, why would there be consistency, right? If you're following Robin Carhart-Harris's entropic brain hypothesis model, there's an extra noise being inserted into these, layer 5 pyramidal neurons. You're getting extra excitability, more disorder. Why would that cause consistency in the hallucinations? Why would that, if it's just sort of increasing noise, at least in my view, it doesn't seem like you would get this 85% of people report sort of a similar type thing. And then you have all these archetypal images that people seem to see, like the great serpent or the mother, or the mantis. Like, how do you explain this, or how do you think about this? Because in my mind, neurochemistry, pharmacology just kind of runs into a wall here in explaining why people would see this consistency in structure and form, and often these crystalline figures, symmetrical, multifold structures seem common. Like that, it doesn't seem to me like neurochemistry and pharmacology explain that. But I'm curious, with all of your, work and experience, like, how do you think about what's happening in these moments?
Well, yeah, I'll start off by saying there's probably like multiple etiologies and factors to consider, right? So some of it, you can never get away from cultural influences. For one thing, you can't have a culturally unmediated experience, or an unculturally mediated experience, if you like. So we are the kind of product of our environments, and everything we've ever seen and experienced could be kind of seeping in and priming the kind of experience we have. So it's a bit hard to get beyond that. And yet I don't think it still reliably accounts for some of the consistencies we see. So myself and Andrew Clemore tried exploring that particularly. And so we went back to the very first DMT trip reports from Stephen Zara in the 1950s. And sure enough, embedded in there in these obscure Hungarian psychiatric journals, there were accounts of people encountering little people, dwarves. And so, like, it's hard to imagine that that was the seed of these later, oh, you get elves, everybody does memes, right? And it seems that there's as good a kind of consideration that there is just something inherent about the experience which leads to the encounter of little people. But we can't ever get away from the cultural influences.
I agree with that.
There was this kind of urban legend mythological experiment which never happened, which came out of Berkeley in the 1970s, that had given ayahuasca to Inuits, right? And supposedly they saw jaguars and snakes. Would have been a brilliant experiment pre-internet if that could have ever happened, but it didn't happen. It was just an urban myth. But that's the kind of thing you'd have had to do. And it's almost impossible now in the internet age to know that we are having experiences which aren't culturally mediated. So it's quite hard to establish that, first of all. And then you have, Robin's take on it is that, yeah, we're having this kind of like highly kind of chaotic sensory experience or internal experience through stimulation of neurotransmitters. And that leads to kind of more kind of informational noise. And then in a kind of apophenic or pareidolic way, we then literally, in Robin's case, we quite literally see, patterns in the chaos, in the noise. Now that explanation goes some way, but it doesn't account necessarily for the consistency, or necessarily even that that actually happens. So, we found that even people with aphantasia have no visual mental imagery still get DMT entities. And so it's not being visually driven. It's not being driven by mental imagery, visual mental imagery, because they really genuinely don't have any, as far as we can tell. You can do kind of cognitive behavioral measures on them, and, their pupils don't dilate in response to imagery of light like everyone else does, so it seems like they genuinely have no visual mental imagery. So that it's not a kind of visual driver.
I find this so fascinating. I've spoken to almost all the leading aphantasia researchers in the world now. I just think it's so cool. Yeah, I have this whole story. Like my sister discovered she has aphantasia at the age of 31, so it's just been this really interesting thread on the podcast. Um,
I would like to ask you a question. I'd be interested to hear
Please.
what the Carl Pearson and Keogh and what the others what do they make of psychedelic experiences and aphantasia? Because as far as I can tell, the majority I suspect do not have any visual mental imagery, even with psychedelics. And then there are these odd cases of people with aphantasia who do get some visual mental imagery when tripping.
S- So, from speaking to people like Adam Zeman and Alfredo Spagna, they're actually not too surprised to hear that psychedelics could induce visual imagery because aphantasia really seems to be about voluntarily generating that imagery. So, you can still kind of get this spontaneous stream, or some people can get this spontaneous stream. So, like, in the what aphantasia seems to be related to is like the frontal cortex orchestrating this top down voluntary control and starting the process of, okay, let's generate the image. So that's the voluntary component. And Alfredo seems to think that it's issues in the connectivity between frontal cortex and V1 and the fusiform imagery node that is probably at the heart of aphantasia. But if the psychedelics are basically conjuring up these mental imagery in a non-voluntary way, they seemed pretty okay with the idea that people with aphantasia could experience mental imagery. Like a lot of people with aphantasia dream visually. The surveys have different results, but Adam
Mm.
Zeman said over 50%.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's the voluntary component that seems a crucial part of aphantasia, which is why the psychedelics one it seems so interesting. But it's work they all want to do and can't get the money for. That's pretty much the answer that I've gotten from all of them.
Yeah, I've been planning to do one of these studies for years now, but yeah, we'll get around to it. But somebody will do one sooner enough. But it's a super interesting question, and my bet it would be that those people who, the half of aphantasics who get visual mental imagery in dreams, at least sometimes, might be the ones more susceptible to some visual
Yes.
imagery, the psychedelics. But let's see.
Yes. How did
But again,
you
it's always the anomalies which kind of throw up some really interesting questions about our assumptions about consciousness. There's the weirder stuff points the way.
For sure. Do you think there's anything to the telepathy tapes?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I mean, there's definitely something to it, and I'm not sure what that is. Right? I mean, it's an extraordinary case and phenomena. It's challenging to kind of look at it evidentially, scientifically to some extent, because for one thing, and my limited understanding of it, there's always their parental figure in the room that, is to what extent has nonverbal cues been kind of eradicated. A lot of it's on tape rather than video. And so, it's not being run as a controlled experiment. I think there's some phenomena there that definitely deserves further explanation. Whether or not this is kind of robust evidence for telepathy in nonverbal autistic people, I'm not sure. But I think it's hugely interesting and suggestive, at the very least. And if there can be ways of devising better controlled experiments without compromising the participants, significantly, i.e., they need to have their parent in the room or they'll freak out, kind of thing. That's part of the problem. Then great, let's see that. But I think, yeah, I think all these things are worthwhile exploring. And, in principle, I don't see anything wrong with it. I think what differs in this kind of research from a lot of the other kind of telepathic research in parapsychology over the last 144 years is that the results are incredibly high. They're getting like 100% success rate sometimes with these cases, which isn't like how we ordinarily see psi as functioning. When we get it working, it's usually just like somewhat above like significance. It's like very small effect sizes. It's a bit erratic. It's not very robust. It's a bit fuzzy. But yeah, they are a special group, so maybe they have some special abilities. It needs exploring some more, I'd say, as ever.
Do you th- does it not seem like if there really was something interesting in that direction, that someone would have thrown a couple of billion at it, even a couple of million, like, because it just seems like such an extraordinary ability with such extraordinary claims that why hasn't a scientist applied for that grant and just done this in the most rigorous, foolproof methodological, like, maybe nothing is foolproof, but like you blind it as much as you can and you really create some good studies around this. It really seems like that would have been done if there was anything interesting in that direction.
I think sometimes the stories are more interesting than the actual science, and I think like most people want stories, right? And scientists want science. We want really hard science. We want to know for sure. But that became like more popular than the Joe Rogan as a podcast for a while, like Telepathy Tapes, and like same with Danny Gola, with his DMT laser experiment. It's not an
Yeah.
experiment. He's primed everybody to have the experience, and he could have made that
Yes.
into an experiment. He could have gone,
Yes.
okay, I'm not going to tell you what you're expected to see, and I'm not going to sit there with you and talk you through the whole process until you see what you're meant to see. He could have run it in a more blind way, and we might have some interesting data, right? But like now, okay, for the 100 odd people who have seen the Matrix and Danny's Laser Quest, like we can't be sure that it wasn't just because of priming. So
Yes.
that could have been done as an experiment, an actual experiment. Uh, but now all we have is like, great, we've got this kind of weird story, which we can't discern either way because we can't now guarantee anybody's not already been primed to see the code. So like, yeah, yeah. So
For people unfamiliar with the DMT laser experiment, could you just kind of lay out what exactly is happening there in terms of what's the experiment, quote unquote, that they're doing, and what are the claims being made around it?
So Danny, my limited understanding of it is basically found that if you put is it 50 hertz frequency laser, red light, and you kind of angle it bouncing off the wall, and then on a smallish doses of DMT, if you were to stare at the kind of refracted laser light, you will, if you look hard enough and deep enough, see some code. And if we were actually running an experiment, I wouldn't tell you what that is, but it turns out it's a bit like kind of cross between kind of Hebrew and Japanese hiragana, katakana, uh, letters kind of twinkling, like moving through space in a pixelated way, much like in the film The Matrix. It turns out, and so like, and then some people have seen it. A lot of people haven't. A lot of people have tried. I've tried. I didn't see anything. Other people have tried very hard and didn't get anything. So like, and that's interesting. So we can't actually now do any experiments to kind of blindly reproduce those effects, but we could look at, say, suggestibility. Like, is there something different about people who see the code against those who don't? We might find out something else, but we don't know what the nature of the code is.
What seems sort of absurd to me is that, I think it's a fine claim to say that the combination of DMT and laser, like the optical properties of laser diffraction at an angle, creates this sort of strange visual phenomena that we can't really explain. That's kind of mildly interesting and sort of weird and anomalous, right? Like, we just like, it's interesting. Why is it like that? No one really knows. But then why the hell is it immediately the code to the simulation and proof that we're in the matrix? It's like that jump. I'm just like, wait, where did we get to that? Like, we just said that there was some characters that people are seeing and they're not even really seeing the same characters, and some people aren't seeing any characters. But why is that the code to the matrix all of a sudden? Like, that seems like a bit of a leap. Maybe that needs some explanation.
Yeah, we haven't even got to that bit, but like for sure, there's some like few assumptions at work here.
So you said you did it and didn't see anything.
No, I mean, it's
Yeah.
not I didn't see anything. I was like, I could just about make out things starting to pixelate a little bit, but it was like, this is like, you really, like trying my hardest. I mean, it was the fact that I was having to really try, and it was like, how much of my own kind of imaginal overlay am I kind of forcing onto this perception to kind of cram it into this, like, into what it's meant to be. But
Yes.
no, I didn't. It was not easy. It didn't come simply, and I wasn't going, "Oh wow, look, there's the Matrix." But like But there's something interesting at work, as ever.
Do you think that there has been good work done on telepathy? Like, is there a good study that, obviously doesn't prove it as a phenomena, but has good, scientific methodology, has employed like a good method, and it does show something weird that is inexplicable? Like, is there an example you can give of like psi that is like you just look at and you're like, wow, that's weird?
I mean, the Ganzfeld research, I would say, like as a body of research, is some of the most widely conducted and well controlled. And it started out in the 70s, and it's set up primarily as a telepathy kind of experiment. You have like a sender in one room and somebody in a kind of sound attenuated room in a Ganzfeld state, who's the receiver, and so like it started off in a very analog way, and then there was this whole kind of criticism from skeptics, and then eventually there was this kind of joint communique, and they set out the kind of protocol for a rigorously controlled experiment, which then was kind of replicated repeatedly after that. And the results of, like, with increasing like quality control over the years, it's now been refined to the point where I think the data coming out of it is pretty robust, and you're still getting effects. Like, you're getting like 30%, 32% hit rate as opposed to 25% by chance, but it's still like pretty consistent, and it's kind of plateaued. So like as a body of work, and that's the nature of science, is like not any one experiment is enough to kind of, for the veracity of any kind of claims, I don't think. But a body of work, a collection of work, does stand a better chance of doing that. Um, for me personally, that there's always the problem with telepathy that it might actually just be precognition anyway. Like, we can't really be sure of the source of this information or where it's coming from necessarily. And so, and there's also the extra risk of some kind of sensory leakage between two people in the same kind of window of time. So if you run precognition experiments, which uh if like the information only comes from the future, and that's controlled, it can't be telepathy, it can't be clairvoyance, and it can't be sensory leakage, and so we can only know for sure that it's probably precognition or some really weird quirk of probability, which we're happy to disregard, because everything in science is based on probability, right? Even the existence of the Higgs boson, that could be, it looks like some kind of exotic psychokinesis experiment to parapsychology. And actually, we find even better results in things like the Global Consciousness Project. They got like I think they got a 5 sigma statistic figure for the Higgs boson. Um, in the Global Consciousness Project, they got like a 6 sigma improbable kind of like statistical outcome, and costs like a fraction of the price of running the Higgs boson experiment. But like, to parapsychologists, is you get a bunch of physicists together and go, okay, we're speculating on the possible existence of this thing with some kind of theoretical underpinning, and we're going to base the existence of that thing on, like, extremely improbable statistics. Then and we accept it on that basis, then why don't we do that for psi phenomena as well? It's, because this is physics, and we're real scientists, and that's parapsychology, and we don't believe that exists. Uh,
Yes.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel